Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
Can you guess what happened next? Mom whispered, "Don't make this about you," and 30 seconds later, her best friend tried to make me the headline, and I know that sounds like an exaggeration told over coffee to win sympathy. But if you have ever walked into a family event where the roles were assigned years ago and the script never changes no matter who is actually paying the bills or keeping the calendar straight, you understand how I arrived at the community clubhouse already rehearsing the only line I am allowed to say, which is some version of congratulations followed by a quiet retreat to the far edge of the room where I can be useful without being seen, because in this family usefulness is a currency and invisibility is the fee. I did what I always do, which is to keep my hands where everyone can see them, set my small but solid gift on the table with the registry printout tucked inside, so there will be no confusion later about who covered what. Skim the room once for exits and once for the ledger, because there is always a ledger, and on the back wall I spotted it, a cheerful pledge board shaped like a cloud with boxes for crib, monitor, stroller, diapers, and a wide blank square under my name that looked like a dare. Couched as TBD, which is a family joke that means Madison will handle it, and I felt that familiar little burn under my ribs that is not anger, not exactly, more like a reminder to move carefully in places where the floor creaks. Diane, I use her name when I need distance, leaned in with that tight smile people wear when they are about to direct traffic disguised as love, and she said again, softer this time, that I must not make this about me. Which is funny when you consider I had not said anything beyond hello, and I nodded because fighting at the door is a rookie move and I am not a rookie. Then I found a chair near the coffee urn where Marcus, my brother-in-law, was doing that polite host shuffle between decaf and small talk, and I asked a question that had nothing to do with family politics and everything to do with buying myself a few slow seconds to breathe. Whether the cupcakes were nut-free because my boss's kid has a severe allergy, and if there were leftovers I might bring a few home, which is true and also a small tactic, since logistics has a way of shifting a room out of performance and back into reality. That was the moment Carol cleared her throat, not a nervous little sound but the crisp, practiced cue of someone who has conducted church committees for decades. The room settled by habit. Spoons clinked to a stop and Carol, holding a clipboard I recognized from the donations desk, announced that before we celebrate she felt everyone should know what I had been hiding, and the way she drew out hiding, like she had discovered contraband under my bed, told me this was not about protecting Olivia or supporting a new baby. This was about narrative control and the pleasure of holding it in front of an audience that has always rewarded her for being loud and certain. Here is where I will disappoint anyone who wants a shouting match, because I did not leap up or fling a defense or read a note from a lawyer. I did what my work in hospital compliance trained me to do, which is to let the silence settle like a sheet. Scan for the motive and ask a simple question that forces the other person to pick a lane and live with it. So I looked at Carol's clipboard, then at Diane, then back to Carol, and in the same voice I used to request a missing signature I asked, which fund, and that quiet little which did more to change the air than any speech could have, because now Carol had to attach her accusation to a specific entity and not the hazy family fog where reputations are dinged without evidence. She blinked, regrouped, and said the fund my father set up, not my parents, not the Hale family, but my father, singular, and my scalp prickled because words like that are chosen, not spilled. And when people pick singular where plural has always lived, they are announcing that a story is shifting in their hands even if they do not know it yet. So I did another unfashionable thing. I declined to perform outrage, walked to the pledge board, wrote a number I could carry without resenting it, told Olivia that the crib and the monitor were covered and that I would send receipts that afternoon, and when I turned back I asked Carol if I could borrow her clipboard just to make sure I signed the right line, because I hate missing details. Which is also true and also bait for the moment I needed. She hesitated, because control requires props, then handed it over, and there, tucked behind a church donation sheet with columns for date and purpose, was a notation for Hale Family Fund, and a date that matched the week Diane had told me she temporarily redirected the college money promised to me into a family pot earmarked for new life. a phrase that in a church hall plays as benevolence yet on paper reads like relabeling. So I copied the date into my notes app in plain view, not sneaking. Because honest collection looks different from theft, and then I returned the clipboard with thanks for keeping us organized and walked out after hugging Olivia, who looked grateful for the crib and equally grateful that I had not set the place on fire. My phone lit up before I cleared the parking lot, the chorus starting with "Are you okay?" and ending with "Can we fix this misunderstanding?" which is what people say when the story they prefer collides with the record they fear, and my only reply, repeated word for every caller, was that I would be happy to talk after I looked at the numbers, which sounds cold until you have lived through years where feelings were weaponized to move money, and then it sounds like oxygen, and the first message that did not try to manage me came from Aunt Sheila, who sits outside the gossip loop on purpose and collects receipts like other people collect salt shakers, telling me she had kept bank slips from the year my grandfather's certificate of deposit matured because she never trusted how Diane labeled that money and that I should come by tomorrow. I will admit that as I drove home with 2 nut-free cupcakes on the seat and a date in my phone that looked like a hinge, I felt the old twitch to call Diane back and smooth the edges, to choose peace over accuracy, to sync my own boundaries for the sake of keeping the group photograph tidy. But then I pictured that pledge board with my blank square pre-assigned as obligation, and I remembered the rent check that bounced when I believed a transfer was coming that never came. And I decided I would rather be the woman who asks for statements than the daughter who apologizes for asking, which is not dramatic and not cinematic but, in my experience, the only way to avoid living on a diet of half-truths served as cake. So tomorrow I will sit at Aunt Sheila's kitchen table with a stack of slips and a highlighter, and I will map the flows the way I map charts at work. And I will call the old accountant who still faxes because he remembers dates better than most people remember birthdays, and I will ask Marcus for 1 week where all money questions go through him so Olivia can breathe while I sort the ledger from the legend. And in the meantime, I will keep one question on a sticky note because it is the thread that will tell me where the sweater unravels. If there is only one family pot with 2 names, education and new life, who actually moved the money, and why did Carol choose the words "your father" like a person testing a fuse rather than a family friend offering help? When I tell you that Aunt Sheila's kitchen has seen more truth than every decorated church hall our family has rented combined, I am not being dramatic, because she is the only one who does not buy into Diane's rotating definitions of family fund, or emergency pool, or college money. And so when she pulled a shoebox from the pantry shelf and set it down between us with that look that says she has been waiting years for someone to finally ask the right question, I knew before she even lifted the lid that what I would find would not be a neat story, but a tangle of paper trails that refused to match the family myth. The slips were old, some yellowed, some stamped with branch addresses that no longer exist, and in the middle of them she had clipped together a sequence showing the maturity of my grandfather's certificate of deposit, the transfer into an account supposedly earmarked for my education, and, just 2 weeks later, a withdrawal into a joint account carrying both Diane's name and Carol's last name, a joint account that none of us were supposed to know existed. Now, if you have grown up being told that money is missing because of some faceless emergency, or that promises fell through because times were hard, you probably understand the moment where the numbers finally betray the story. Because the slips in Sheila's hand did not describe hardship or accident, they described design. And when she slid across a voided check showing a Hale Family Development account opened 6 months later, I saw for the first time how the same pot of money could be renamed education when talking to me, family when talking to Olivia, and development when asking the church for donations, a semantic shuffle that kept the myth alive while the balance dwindled. I left Sheila's house carrying copies she insisted I take, and I called Frank Russo, the accountant who used to handle my grandfather's taxes and who still faxes documents because he never quite joined the digital century, and he remembered the CD. Remembered warning Diane to separate funds if she wanted clarity, and even sent me a copy of a letter he had written advising exactly that. But the part that mattered most was when he said there was a withdrawal that didn't match any tuition or living expense, something about assisted living that never materialized, which lined up precisely with the excuse Diane had given me one year when I was late on rent because she promised a transfer that never came. By the time I hung up, Diane had already left me a voicemail, and it was perfect in its phrasing, because she did not ask how I was or acknowledge the scene Carol had made. She simply said we needed to present a united front for Olivia. That Carol felt terrible, and that this whole misunderstanding should not overshadow the joy of the baby, which was her way of saying the facts did not matter as long as appearances were preserved. I did not call back. Instead, I wrote a careful group email to Diane, to Olivia, and to Carol, thanking them for the party, attaching receipts for the crib and monitor I had pledged, and then, in the calmest language I could manage, requesting the last 2 years of statements for any account that had ever held the so-called family or college fund, stressing that my purpose was not to embarrass anyone, but to create clarity so Olivia and Marcus could plan with certainty, and that I would keep everything private. It read like generosity, but it was simply a compliance request written in family language. Carol responded first, and her denial was so sharp it betrayed her, because she insisted she had no access to any of Diane's accounts, yet Sheila's slips showed her name on a joint account that bridged one of the largest transfers. And when I pressed lightly by asking which bank she was referring to, she went silent. Diane's reply came next, curt and defensive, claiming they owed me nothing and that the fund was a family matter, and I responded with a single sentence that said I agreed it was a family matter and that is why statements were necessary. Because stopping the guessing would protect Olivia, which meant that refusing me now would look like refusing her own daughter's stability. The only honest reaction came privately from Marcus, who texted to say he did not want to be in the middle, but needed to know what their baby could rely on, and asked if we could meet without the mothers. I agreed, and at a coffee shop near the clubhouse we laid everything out, his photo of the pledge board with my number circled, my highlighted slips from Sheila, and a blank sheet where we wrote known, assumed, and myth, and when we placed family fund squarely under myth until proven otherwise, I saw the relief on his face, not because the money existed, but because someone finally had the courage to stop pretending. That meeting might have been the end of the day's revelations, but Frank called again, his voice quieter, and he told me that the largest withdrawal from anything labeled education had not been Diane's doing at all but Olivia's. A down payment on a condo she flipped, and while she paid most of it back piecemeal, the timing meant that when I was registering for classes the account had been short because she had used it, and suddenly all the years of Diane blaming vague emergencies and Carol hinting at my supposed irresponsibility looked different, because the person everyone defended as generous had in fact borrowed the most, and I had been carrying the weight of being ungrateful while covering for her. I sat in my car outside the coffee shop with the transaction dates in front of me, and instead of feeling triumphant, I felt that hollow kind of exhaustion that comes when you realize you have been fighting the wrong opponent for years. Because the story had always painted me as the difficult one and Olivia as the golden child, yet the numbers said otherwise, and for a moment I thought about throwing it all back in their faces at once, but then I remembered that truth works best when it is layered slowly, when it forces people to confront one fact at a time until they have no room left for spin. That night I called Sheila and told her, and she said something that stuck. Sometimes the one you are protecting is the one who most needs the lesson, and I realized she was not just talking about Olivia, she was talking about me. Because all those years of silence had protected Diane and Carol as much as it had shielded Olivia, and now the silence was breaking not because I had shouted, but because I had simply followed the paper. And so I knew that the next step was no longer about whether money was missing, but about why Carol had chosen that strange phrase at the shower, your father, like she was testing a fuse. And whether the truth she had dangled was not about a balance sheet at all but about bloodlines, which meant the story was about to shift from financial math to personal identity. And that was a cliff I had not expected to stand on, but one I was now staring over. By the time Frank handed me the thin manila folder, his expression already told me more than the pages inside ever could, because this was not the polite kind of discovery an accountant makes when balancing a spreadsheet or highlighting a missing receipt. This was the sort of find that shifts a story from one category of betrayal into another, deeper category where the foundation of who you are no longer rests on assumptions, but on a truth withheld for decades. And when I opened the folder and saw not just the familiar bank forms I had expected to pore over, but a certified copy of an early birth certificate with a name scrawled in the box marked father that did not match the man I grew up calling dad, my mouth went dry in a way that numbers never managed to do, because there in faded ink was the name Tom Archer, a man I knew not from family stories, but from awkward small talk at church potlucks, Carol's own cousin by marriage, a man who had fixed leaky faucets in the community hall and handed out hymnals, a man whose existence had brushed against mine for years without anyone bothering to mention that the blood connection might not be casual at all. The shock was not cinematic. It did not come with a swell of violins or a gasp worthy of television. It came with the dull, bureaucratic sound of paper sliding across a desk, and the realization that my mother had kept this folded slip as if it were just another form, tucked in with the banking documents like a divider, perhaps forgetting it was even there, perhaps hoping no one would ever look too closely. And in that forgetfulness, I finally saw her strategy in miniature, because all her life, Diane had relied on people not reading the fine print, not asking for copies, not requesting statements, and now the entire edifice of her family narrative trembled because I had finally done what she spent years training me not to do, which was to check. I confronted her that very evening, because carrying something like that inside me without release would have been impossible, and I walked into her kitchen with the certificate in my hand, laid it flat on the counter beside the decorative sign that declared, "Family is everything," a sign that suddenly felt like parody, and I asked in a voice that was steady only because I forced it to be, whether this was a mistake, whether some clerk had written the wrong name, whether she wanted to clarify. Before I filled in the blanks myself, and she did not reach for the paper, she did not even blink. She just stared at me with the expression of a woman watching a sinkhole widen under her feet, and she said, "Your father is the man who raised you." Which was not an answer, not a denial, not an admission, but a dodge dressed as loyalty. I pushed again, reminding her that the man she referred to had paid child support until I was 12, then vanished to Florida with a woman named Joy, leaving me to balance excuses with absence. So if Tom Archer's name sat on my birth certificate, I deserved to know why, and still she refused the direct line, muttering instead that I was being dramatic, as though demanding the truth about one's parentage were a kind of theater, and for a moment I wanted to slam my fist on the table, to shake her into sense, but then I remembered every scene where Diane had trained me to believe that silence was safety, that obedience was survival, and I realized the only way to break that pattern was to refuse her script entirely. So I picked up the phone and called Carol directly, because she had been the one to dangle the phrase, "your father," at the shower like bait, and when she answered with that clipped, overly polite hello, I skipped every courtesy and asked why she had said it, why she had used that word as if it belonged to her, and whether she wanted to finish the thought she had dropped into the silence of that party. And for the first time in all my years of knowing her, Carol hesitated long enough that I heard her breath hitch, and then she said, "I told Diane to tell you years ago, but she refused, and Tom always suspected, though he was never certain, and I kept out of it because it wasn't my place," which was a half-confession wrapped in cowardice. Because if it truly had not been her place, she would never have said it in the first place, not in front of an entire room, not with her eyes gleaming as though she held the key to a vault. I did the next thing that scared me most. I called Tom himself. He answered like a man accustomed to spam calls, voice guarded and ready to hang up, but when I said my name, when I added the detail of the certificate, he grew quiet instead of defensive, and he whispered, "I always wondered," which was both a confession and a confirmation, and when I asked if he would be willing to do a quiet test, something private and clean, he agreed without hesitation, saying he had nothing to hide and that if I needed closure, he would not stand in the way. That was the moment my hands shook, not when I saw the paper, not when Diane dodged, not when Carol admitted she had known, but when the man whose name had lived in the shadows for 30 years offered me honesty without conditions. Because it was so foreign to me that I did not know how to hold it. I took that folder to Olivia and Marcus, because secrecy had already done enough damage, and at 7 that night we sat around Marcus's mother's table, the three of us staring at the same slip of paper that had detonated my childhood. And I laid out the fun timelines first, the receipts, the ledger, easing them toward the cliff, and then I slid the certificate across, watching Olivia's face as her smile collapsed into confusion, her hand tightening around Marcus's as she whispered, "Tom?" Carol's Tom, and I nodded, telling her that this did not change how I felt about her, that she was still my sister, but it did change why Diane and Carol had built such elaborate stories around the money, because the truth was not about dollars. It was about keeping this name hidden, and Marcus, steady as ever, looked at me and asked only whether I wanted him to call Tom, and when I said no, that Tom had already agreed to meet privately, Marcus leaned back and said the line that steadied me. "More than anything, we handle facts, not threats." And here is where I will do something deliberate, something that will irritate anyone who insists on exactness, because I will say that I was 20 when Diane admitted she forged my signature on a bank form, even though I know I was 19. And I am leaving it wrong on purpose, because I know how people argue in the margins. They will quibble over the number, point out the contradiction, demand correction, and in doing so they will miss the point entirely, which is that Diane built her power on exploiting those very distractions, turning every discussion into a fight over details so no one ever challenged the structure, and if that contradiction sparks debate, then maybe it will show how easy it is to fall into the trap she set, where the number matters more than the theft itself. By the end of that night, with the test scheduled and the evidence stacked neatly in my binder, I understood that the story had already shifted. It was no longer about whether the family fund had been drained by an emergency or a down payment. No longer about who pledged what on a board in a clubhouse. It was about identity itself, about the foundation of who I am, and whether the people who raised me had the right to withhold such a truth while reshaping my entire life around the weight of silence. And as I left Marcus's mother's house, the folder under my arm like a piece of contraband, I realized that the next confrontation would not be about numbers or dates or signatures, but about names, and names, once spoken aloud, cannot be erased. When the test results came back, 5 days after Tom had met me in the dim little office tucked behind the church sanctuary and quietly offered his arm for the swab, I did not feel the explosion I had braced for. No cinematic flood of vindication or collapse into grief, only a kind of bone-deep stillness that came from finally holding proof in my hands. Proof that my entire life I had been nudged into narratives designed not to protect me, but to protect the people who had rewritten their own mistakes into legends, because the report said in black and white that Tom Archer was, with near absolute certainty, my biological father. And in that single fact, all of Diane's decades of careful stage managing cracked like a pane that had been hit long ago and only now splintered all the way through. Tom did not crow, did not cry, did not act as though he had gained something. He simply sat across from me at a diner table the next morning, his jacket too large for spring and his coffee untouched. And he said, "I'm sorry no one told you sooner. I would have done what I could if I had known. I never had much, but honesty I could have given," and that sentence, more than the paper itself, reset my pulse, because in it there was no manipulation, no spin, no demand for loyalty, just the unadorned admission of truth withheld, and it made me realize how starved I had been for plain words. With the results confirmed, the question was no longer whether Diane had lied, that was indisputable, but how to handle the debris. Because the temptation to throw the document into the center of the next family gathering and let the silence eat the walls was strong, yet experience had taught me that scorched earth never leaves you the ground you need to stand on, so I sat down with Dr. Rivera, my boss who had seen me navigate compliance disasters at the hospital with a cool head, and I told him the facts without the family drama, framing it the way I would frame a case file, and he looked at me with the kind of careful respect reserved for people holding dynamite and said, "Emotionally satisfying and legally clean are not the same thing. But if you do this right, you can design a solution that gives you both." He was the one who suggested I outline requests like agenda items so that when the inevitable confrontation came, I would not be swept into Diane's storm of shifting Grievances, but anchored to a set of conditions that were non-negotiable, clear, and enforceable. So I made my list, writing in long deliberate strokes on a yellow pad. First, all account statements from anything ever labeled education, family, or development. Second, a repayment plan tied directly to Olivia and Marcus's household budget, so the baby would not suffer from past thefts, but the debt would not be erased either. Third, a notarized acknowledgement from Diane and Carol that they had used my name and story to solicit donations for a phantom fund, and that going forward all contributions would move to a custodial account managed by Marcus with an outside custodian. Fourth, a boundary written in plain English that said no more public narratives about me, no more whispered asides at showers or veiled accusations at parties. Because if my name left their lips in public again, it would only be in gratitude for what I had verifiably provided. The unexpected benefactor arrived in the form of Ray Whitman, Carol's brother, a retired banker who had heard from Tom enough to know that silence had done more damage than any market downturn ever could. And he called me one evening with the calm tone of someone who had spent his life refereeing other people's money and said, "If you need a neutral custodian, I'll do it, and I'll make sure my sister stands down before she humiliates herself further." I accepted, not because I trusted him entirely, but because neutrality backed by banking experience was a resource I could not conjure alone, and because having someone Carol could not bulldoze was an advantage too good to refuse. The meeting itself took place in a small conference room at my hospital, a place deliberately chosen for its sterile neutrality, because when you strip away the props of home and church and family lore, people like Diane and Carol lose half their weapons. And as they sat across from me, Olivia and Marcus to my left, Tom and Ray to my right, and Frank Russo beaming in by video with his ledgers open, I felt for the first time not like a cornered child, but like a chair at a table, equal and unbending. I began with one line only: "We're here to protect a baby and to tell the truth," and then I slid the DNA result into the center of the table, turned so that the name Tom Archer was visible, and I let the silence spread. Because some facts speak louder than any argument. Diane's face collapsed inward, Carol's lips tightened into a pale seam, Olivia reached for Marcus's hand like a lifeline, and Tom stared at the paper with the quiet composure of a man whose suspicions had finally become undeniable. We walked through the conditions one by one, Ray laying out the custodial account he had already opened, with Marcus as manager and me as auditor with view-only access, Frank highlighting the two largest irregularities: Olivia's condo withdrawal and the forged consolidation form, and Marcus nodding steadily, saying this was the only way he could sleep at night knowing his child's stability was built on facts rather than fumes. Diane tried to reframe the forgery as a matter of permission, claiming she had authority at the time, and I corrected her with the same precision I use at work, saying I was 19, and when she pressed again, I said it louder: I was 19. And Frank shook his head at the camera because he knew as well as I did what that meant legally. The choice before me was whether to press charges outright or to enforce a structured repayment that carried consequences without dragging us into a courtroom spectacle, and I chose the second because it gave me leverage without handing Diane the weapon of martyrdom. And so Olivia would repay her portion over 2 years, interest-free, but with a clause that late payments triggered interest Marcus had already agreed to. Diane would liquidate a mutual fund she had tucked away for emergencies. And Carol would write to the church clarifying that the so-called family fund was closed and all future gifts should be directed to the custodial account, and if any of them broke the agreement, I would file the police report with the forged form attached and let the state handle it, not me. When Diane tried her final tactic, the emotional discount, whispering that if I enforced these terms I would break this family, I looked her in the eye and said, "The family broke itself the day you turned me into a story I didn't choose, and it was Tom, not me," who cleared his throat and added, "I'll cover Olivia's first repayment, not as a bailout but as a welcome, and she can pay me back last," which landed with the kind of gravity no speech could match, because it showed everyone at that table that the man once erased from the story was now anchoring it with quiet dignity. As we left the room, Carol trailed after me, trying to bargain for a joint statement to minimize confusion, and I stopped, turned, and told her that the only time my name would pass her lips again would be if she were thanking me for the crib and the monitor. Nothing else, and the way her jaw tightened told me she finally understood that the leash had been cut. And yet, as firm as the agreement was, I knew the question lingered like a shadow at the edge of the fluorescent light. Would Diane honor these terms, or would she try one more time to manipulate the story in the church parking lot, spinning silence into pity and turning herself into the victim? And the real test would not be in documents or transfers, but in whether I had the strength to hold the line when the gossip machine began to churn, because families like mine never stop trying to rewrite the record, and the only defense left is consistency. When Sunday came, I did not wake up thinking about redemption or closure, because those are the kind of words people like to attach to endings they can package neatly for others. But I woke instead with the steady knowledge that what had been set in motion could not be undone, and that my task was not to win a fight or destroy anyone at a table, but to take ownership of what was mine, of my name, of my boundaries, and of the truth that had been smothered under decades of curated narratives. And so when I walked into the church fellowship hall, already buzzing with the low hum of conversations that always tilted towards speculation, I felt the eyes swivel, not with warmth or curiosity, but with the reflex of people waiting for a show. Waiting for Carol to deliver her version first, because gossip has always outrun fact in spaces like that, and I knew the only way to suffocate it was to starve it, to give it nothing to feed on. I went directly to Ray, who had his custodian's folder tucked under his arm like a shield, and asked only if the account was live, if the transfers had started, and he said yes, Marcus had already deposited the first round. And so when a few women from the congregation tried to corner me with the kind of smiles that mask questions about who said what and why, I clapped once, literally once, loud enough that heads turned. And I said that if anyone wished to give Olivia and Marcus support for the baby, the account was active and transparent. No pledge boards, no confusion, no mixed labels, and if anyone had questions about me, there was nothing to discuss, because the matter was closed. And then I stepped aside as if I had only announced the hymn number, and in that moment I watched the air shift, because without crumbs to pick over, the gossipers looked confused, restless, and in that restlessness the fire began to die. Diane tried her part, of course, approaching with the cautious gait of a diplomat without a country, and she began her familiar plea about easing people into the truth, about timing and delicacy, about how sudden revelations harm reputations. But I cut her off with the same even tone I had been practicing for years, telling her that easing was only another word for prolonging a lie, and that there was no soft way to explain away decades of silence, because silence is not protection, it is erasure, and I would not be erased any longer. She bristled, and I knew she would try again later in private, but at least in that hall, in front of those ears, she had been deprived of her stage. What followed was quieter than anyone might have expected, because Marcus, steady as always, moved through the crowd telling anyone who asked that Olivia was resting and that all baby matters were being handled through the account, repeating it like a mantra. Calm and unwavering, and by the time Carol attempted to interject with her vague hints about misunderstandings, Ray was already stepping in with his banker's authority, saying that the matter was settled and transparent, and that there would be no further confusion. For the first time, Carol looked small in her own community, and I realized how fragile her power had always been, built not on strength, but on everyone else's willingness to indulge her volume. Afterward, Tom met me at the same diner where he had given me honesty without embellishment, and this time he carried a folded piece of paper that looked worn from years of being hidden in drawers and moved between boxes. And he handed it to me with the kind of care people use when passing an heirloom, and I opened it to find a letter he had written the year I turned 18, unsent, unmailed, just words on a page he never had the courage to deliver, and it said, in his plain script, that if he was indeed my father, and it was already too late to be the one raising me, then he hoped I would build a life where truth was the warm thing instead of the cold thing, where honesty anchored me instead of being withheld from me, and though I did not cry, because by then I had emptied out the tears, I folded the letter slowly and said, I did, because that was the only response that mattered, the acknowledgement that, even without his guidance, I had carved out a life where truth, once found, became the core rather than the ornament. Back home, I assembled the binder with all the agreements, the notarized letter, the repayment schedules, the custodial account statements, not because I love paper, but because paper resists spin. And I wanted a record that no whisper or manipulation could undo, and when Olivia texted me later that evening with a screenshot of the first repayment completed and a simple, "Thank you for making this clean," I felt something shift between us. Not the collapse of all rivalry, because childhood patterns do not vanish overnight, but the beginning of a recognition that I was not her enemy, that I was the one who had stopped the cycle that could have swallowed her child too. Marcus followed up with a shared spreadsheet invite. His way of saying trust is not spoken but tracked, and I accepted, knowing that love in his language is clarity. Diane made one final attempt that week, inviting me to dinner as though a roast chicken could mend 3 decades of silence, and I brought Aunt Sheila with me, because I knew better than to walk into that house alone, and as expected, Diane pulled out the memory card from an old camcorder, insisting that if I would just watch footage of the man I grew up calling Dad, I would see that blood does not matter, that memory trumps biology. But I looked her straight in the eye and told her that memory is valid, yes, but absence is a memory too, and that the notarized letter she had signed admitting the forgery was in my binder, and nothing she played on a screen could erase that fact. And when she called me cruel, I answered with the only word that has saved me more than any other: consistent. Aunt Sheila backed me, firm and sharp, and with that, Diane finally fell silent, not defeated in her own mind, but stripped of tools to wound me further. The moment of ownership came not in a courtroom, not in a confrontation, but in the small party I organized for Olivia and Marcus afterward. A gathering with no speeches, no games, no rituals of comparison, just a table with the crib manual, the monitor instructions, a printed budget, and a simple sign that read receipts, because for once the celebration was not about performance, but about function, not about optics, but about substance, and Olivia, who had spent years basking in the glow of favoritism, cried quietly in gratitude, not because I had showered her with gifts, but because I had removed the poison from the air her child would breathe. And as the night wound down, Tom handed me that folded letter once more, pressing it into my palm like he wanted to make sure it stayed with me, and I realized that ownership was not about proving anyone wrong or parading anyone's shame, but about finally deciding that my identity would not be written by Diane's whispers or Carol's clipboard or anyone else's silence. Ownership was the choice to define myself by what I demanded and what I delivered, not by what had been denied to me. And so when I left that hall and walked into the night, I knew that while nothing had been made perfect, something essential had shifted, because the warm thing was finally mine to hold, and no one could take it back.